This summer, we have been delving into a preaching series on the Old Testament book of Amos. If any of you are like me, I have previously read the book of Amos, but have to honestly say that I didn't remember much of it. So, I've had to study right along with Greg as he has taken us through the first 5 chapters of this book. Today is chapter 6. I just want to review a little about what we have already talked about before we start on today's chapter. We really don't know much about Amos, except for what is said in this book, but we do know he was a shepherd and helped to tend sycamore trees. He seemed to be well educated and lived in the city of Tekoa, which is in the southern kingdom of Judah, about 10 miles south of Jerusalem. Ironically, God called Amos to prophesy in the northern kingdom of Israel. I am sure that at first the Israelites did not know how to act when Amos showed up, not knowing whether he was bringing tidings of good cheer or news of doom and despair. The book of Amos starts with Amos naming many of the surrounding areas and the punishments upon which God will place on them. At first, I'm sure the Israelites are elated that someone was finally talking about the foreign nations around them, places such as Damascus, Gaza, and Tyre. They were probably ecstatic that God was punishing these other nations, and they were being punished not because they were enemies of Israel, but because they had violated their neighbors, doing things like selling people into slavery. But Amos would not stop at these surrounding areas. He would soon hit closer to home when he started talking about where he was from, the land of Judah. Those in Judah had been guilty of idolatry and rejecting God's law. This would probably still have been music to the Israelites' ears, but this attitude quickly shifted when Amos then started talking about them, God's chosen people. Amos accused the Israelites of injustice against the poor and several forms of religious corruption. Amos continued to say that despite all of the different ways God tried to warn them, through famine, drought, locusts, etc., that they still did not repent and just ignored God. And then last week, we saw Amos giving the Israelites a lament or a song of grief, as if they had already been punished. Amos goes on to declare to them that the day of the Lord will be a day of judgment and justice. So that leads us to chapter 6. If you still have your Bibles open, you can follow along as we go through the chapter. In this chapter, Amos will start right off with accusing the powerful and wealthy of arrogant self-satisfaction. He not only mentions Israel and its capital of Samaria, but he also references the leaders of Jerusalem or Zion in Judah, where Amos is from. The people Amos was referring to were at ease and complacent with their lives. They felt secure. At the time of Amos, this area was relatively peaceful and prosperous. Some of these individuals were living high on the hog and were perfectly fine with that. It didn't really matter to them what was going on with everyone else around them. He told the people to look at 3 cities, Calneh, Hamath, and Gath, and asked them if their kingdom was any better than any of these. All of these cities had been conquered before because of their pride. What would happen to Israel in the future would be the same, because Israel's sin was just as great as theirs. Amos went on to explain that these people were living the high life. They had fancy furniture inlaid with expensive ivory. They indulged themselves with fine food and drink. They listened to wonderful music. They anointed themselves with the finest oils. But they had no concept of the troubles of the nation, much less any concern for these things. Because of all of this, Amos clearly announced that it will be these people who will be the first in line to lead the way into exile. The Lord makes a solemn decree in verse 8. I abhor the pride of Jacob and hate his strongholds, and I will deliver up the city and all that is in it. The Lord will make sure that the city and its inhabitants will be handed over to the enemies because of their actions. A scene of survivors hiding and people carrying away bodies to burn is given to us next. The survivors are afraid to mention the name of God, even in a time of grief. They are afraid that God will hear them and then judge them also. Amos then used a couple of rhetorical questions once again, questions which proved that the sins of the Israelites were unnatural. He voiced these questions in verse 12. In verse 13, Amos mentioned the cities of Lodabar and Karnaim. These two cities were previously overtaken by Israel. Israel as a nation would then take this victory as a sign of their own strength and greatness, even though they had been blessed by God. Amos was trying to remind Israel that it wasn't by their own means that they had won these victories, but by God's means. And finally, in verse 14, Amos stated that God will send a nation to rise up against Israel, and that it shall be oppressed from Lebo Hamath to Wadi Araba, or essentially from one end of the country to the other. We now know that that nation would be Assyria. As I have studied this book over the last few weeks, one of the things that I have gotten out of it is that no matter how much things change, so much stays the same. We as a human race are still doing most of the things today that Amos was warning nations about back then. We never seem to learn. Humans are still trafficking people. Humans are still oppressing the poor. Humans are still not relying on God as they should be. We are supposed to learn from our history so that we don't repeat it. However, a lot of times we fall short on that and never learn from our mistakes. Complacency was a large theme that I took out of this 6th chapter of Amos. I looked up the definition of complacency on a few different websites, and the one that I really thought described the Israelites at this time was from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Marked by self-satisfaction, especially when accompanied by unawareness of actual dangers or deficiencies. Some of its synonyms were casual and disinterested. A lot of the people of Israel were comfortable in their surroundings. They were living in a peaceful and prosperous time, so a lot of them were living their best life. They were not concerned with those around them. The poor suffered horribly from this, as the rich sat in their fancy houses, eating their fancy foods and drinking their fancy wines. I believe that the Israelites thought they were content, which is more of a state of happiness, when in reality, they were in a state of complacency. At times, we too still do this today. Sometimes we live above our means just so that we can have the best fill in the blank. We want to keep up with the Joneses. If you remember the television show The Jeffersons, it's kind of like their theme song that says, "We're moving on up to the east side to a deluxe apartment in the sky. We finally got a piece of the pie." And you're welcome that I didn't actually sing that for you. But I could have. I think a lot of times we are all guilty of concerning ourselves with moving on up and not paying attention to who we may leave behind. How do we balance having nice things and adequately giving of our time, talents, and financial offerings? That is a deeply personal question. Depending on the stage you are in your life, your ability to give may be different. When you are young and raising children, it is more difficult to be giving of your time and money. Once you are retired, however, sometimes it becomes easier. I'm reminded of all the retired men and women of this church who faithfully serve loaves and fishes on a regular basis because they have more time to give. How can we balance our lifestyle and our mission to care for our neighbor? It can be difficult sometimes. We live in a society that is constantly telling us that we have to have the best phone, the best car, the best clothing, and if we do that, our lives will be perfect. We are eager to give a myriad of excuses when people ask us to do something that would benefit someone in need. I'm too busy. I'm not qualified to do that. And the excuses go on and on. Like the Israelites, we too can be so engrossed with our life and our things that we also fail to be concerned with those around us. About 14 years ago, my grandmother was on her deathbed in a hospital in Chattanooga. Several members of our family were in the ICU room with her, including my dad. She called him over to her bed and told him several things that day, but the one that I still remember is that she said to him that all of her possessions didn't matter anymore. That has stuck with me this whole time. And similarly, there is a bumper sticker out there that says, "He who dies with the most toys still dies." Sometimes we can become complacent in our lives in general. We can become complacent in our careers, in our relationships and friendships, in our spiritual growth. When we feel comfortable with something, we don't always want to change. I too feel like I have fallen into a few of those categories. The opposite of complacency is action. That calls us to make changes. Sometimes these changes are subtle and sometimes they are dramatic. Change is hard. I get that. I don't always like it. One of humankind's favorite sayings is, "We've always done it that way." And for some things, that doesn't do any harm, but for other things, it can do tremendous harm. I do want to say, though, that there are times in our lives when it is okay to be comfortable where you are. That is, you are content and happy. At that moment, that is your favorite place, and you do not want to be anywhere else. When you are spending good quality time with your family, it is okay to be content. When you're doing your quiet time or you're in your happy place out in nature and you're getting what you need out of that experience, it is okay to be content. A few weeks ago, I took a week of study leave and participated in the Festival of Homiletics, which is a conference to help you fine-tune sermon writing and preaching methods. One of the pastors I heard preach talked about a man who was not okay with complacency. In South Carolina in May of 1862, during the Civil War, the Union had blockaded most of the Atlantic and Gulf coast so that the Confederates could not receive goods. The Confederates were doing their best to guard Charleston and its forts. A ship named the CSS Planter docked one evening in Charleston. There were 3 white officers and 8 slaves on board. For reasons unknown, perhaps they were going to a party or visiting family, the 3 white officers left the ship for the night, leaving the slaves behind. One of these slaves, a man by the name of Robert Smalls, realized that this was the perfect opportunity to leave the life he had and seize the life he always wanted. What happened next was something he had planned for weeks. A couple of the slaves decided to stay behind because if this plan failed, death would surely come to those involved. Smalls put on the captain's hat. It was said that they resembled each other, and he lowered it over his face so as not to be seen. The remaining crew then raised the flags and turned on the boiler, all within the view of one of the Confederate headquarters. They made one stop to pick up the rest of Smalls' family and a few other slaves. The thing about Robert Smalls is that he had spent a great bit of time on the water and knew the Charleston harbor inside and out. He knew when to blow the whistles, which hand signals to give, and even knew exactly how the captain stood on the ship. Smalls and his crew navigated the ship directly into the blockade, and the Confederates did not realize what was going on until it was too late. As they headed in that direction, the flags were replaced with a white sheet to signal surrender. Once at the blockade, Smalls handed the ship over to the Union, and all of those on board, 16 people total, started cheering because they were now free. Smalls would go on to lobby the North to enlist black soldiers and is said to have recruited at least 5,000 on his own. He would also participate in several war missions and would be promoted to captain, a rank he could not have had in the Confederacy. He was said to have been one of the highest paid black soldiers during the war. And the U.S. Congress would go on to reward Smalls monetarily, enough so that he could purchase his former slaveholder's home off of the tax rolls after the war was over. He would go on to have an active political career and fight for the political rights of African Americans as a member of the South Carolina State Assembly and Senate, as well as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Robert Smalls saw an injustice. He saw people being complacent with the ideology of slavery, and it was something he did not agree with. He witnessed the horrors of slavery, even though it was said that the family treated him a little better than most of their other slaves. It was thought that his father was one of the males of the household. But Robert Smalls knew that he didn't want to be owned by anyone, and most importantly, he didn't want his family to be sold off individually to probably never be reunited again. He chose not to be complacent, so he did something about it. He took action. We should look at his story with admiration. Hopefully, we will not be in the same situation, but if there are areas where complacency is not okay, we need to identify those and do something about them. Whether it is a social justice issue, a human rights issue, etc., being complacent can be similar to turning a blind eye. God calls us to take action. We are creatures of habit. We like being in our comfort zones. Author Robin Sharma has been quoted as saying, As you move outside of your comfort zone, what was once the unknown and frightening becomes the new normal. I have a magnet on my refrigerator that I bought at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. It's a quote from John F. Kennedy that says, "One person can make a difference, and everyone should try." I really do believe that. Can I stop world hunger by myself? No, but I can help here in my community. I can donate money to the fuel program or work at Loaves and Fishes to help combat hunger here. Can I stop racism on my own? No, but I can have conversations with others and learn what I can do personally to be a better citizen and treat others the way I want to be treated. And maybe others will notice and follow suit. In these situations, being complacent is like turning a blind eye. We've been asking ourselves during this sermon series, Amos, what do you see? I think in chapter 6, Amos sees a group of people who just don't care about the poor. They don't care about their neighbors. They have amazing lives, and so no one else's life matters to them. They are driving in their car and looking only out the windshield. They never look beside them or behind them to see what else is going on. Thankfully, I feel like we have a congregation that is not like this. We are very mission-oriented and have been for almost the entire 200 years we've been around. Even in the early years of this church, the congregation was taking up collections for various projects. And most recently, you, the congregation, decided to help Loaves and Fishes with the cost of their new facility. I'm thankful that the members of FPC are not complacent. If someone shows up at our doorstep asking for help, we either help them, find someone else present who can help them, or we direct them to a community service that can help them. I am grateful that we are this way. Amos is not done. His story is far from over. He will keep saying things the Israelites do not want to hear and sharing some visions that God has shown him. And we will continue on that journey next week. Amen.